First of all, it is my pleasure as the director of the Enoch Seminar to introduce this event and to welcome all the participants. As usual, we are already a large group, both here on Zoom and then on Facebook, and later on the event will be recorded and broadcast on YouTube as usual. This is actually a sort of pilot episode of an ongoing series, Meet the Author. The idea is to have a conversation with an author that has just published an important publication around a question, a central question raised from his or her work. In this case, our guest is Joshua Paul Smith, the author of a very interesting volume published by Brill, recently published by Brill. Luke was not a Christian, reading the third gospel and the third gospel and Acts within Judaism. So the publication of this book will be the opportunity for a conversation about a central topic, the topic of the Jewishness of the author of Luke Act. We have beside, in addition to Joshua Smith, we have three other guests who are also specialists in the field. We have Isaac Oliver, Jocelyn McWhither, and Joshua Scott. It will be a conversation between the five of us. It will be open to the many people that are attending the meeting on Zoom. The chat will be open for people that want to write comments or questions and want to interact with the panelists. The format will be not the format of a traditional book presentation. It will be more an interview and a seminar between the five of us. We be asking questions, raising questions, and also expressing our own personal view. As I told you, this is the first one, the first event in a series of similar events. In the fall, we'll have the presentation of other three important books in which we will have always a member of the Enoch Seminar interviewing the author of a book at the presence of a panel of specialists. So, but I don't want to spend more time introducing the event, so let's start immediately. Just a few words introducing Joshua Paul Smith. He earned his PhD from the University of Denver and the Iliff School of Theology in 2021, and teaches at Southwest Missouri State University. Josh, it's a pleasure having you, and congratulations first of you for your publication, and also thank you very much for giving us this opportunity to begin this conversation. The subtitle of your book is Reading the First Gospel and Acts within Judaism. As you know, now there is a lot of literature that follows these new trends of research. It started with Jesus within Judaism, then we had Paul within Judaism, then John within Judaism, and now I guess Luke within Judaism. Why? So let's start from this question. I mean, how do you find this? Why? And how you find this approach, this methodological approach within Judaism so interesting and also so important for studying the third gospel and Acts?
Excellent. Yes, and thank you, Gabriele, for inviting me, and I'm really excited to be here today. I think so. Part of my inspiration for writing the book was I kept seeing this widespread assumption among scholars that Luke is the most Gentile gospel, right? It's sort of it's something that just sort of permeated the atmosphere of New Testament studies. And over time, I began to question those assumptions, which I had inherited as well. And I think it's important because reading Luke and Acts within Judaism, Acts is really the only historical narrative, the narrative of the early development of the early Christian tradition that many Christians have had for 2,000 years now, and it has served as the basis for a considerable degree of anti-Judaism, anti-Semitism, and I think part of that has been heightened by this assumption that Luke was writing from a Gentile Christian perspective. And so part of what I was trying to do is maybe course correct a little bit and tamper those expectations so that we can reconsider the Jewishness of Luke, both within the field of biblical studies, but also within Jewish and Christian religious circles as well. Yeah.
Yeah, and just to help us, I mean, start the conversation, what do you think are the most important conclusions of your research on this subject? What is the end of the journey? I mean, we described the motivations, and now we will be curious to know about your conclusions. I mean, what is the points that you think you have discovered and you would like to share with us?
Well, I think the first issue is because of the degree to which the parting of the ways has been sort of pushed further and further, I guess, ahead past the first, second century. I think we're at a point where, as Isaac Oliver has said, we really should be looking at these New Testament texts as Jewish until proven Gentile, and I would like to see that as sort of the working assumption that New Testament scholars approach to their texts. I also think that I think the main conclusion of my book is not that we can know for certain, beyond any reasonable doubt that Luke was writing from within a Jewish perspective, but I think that the actual data that we have, by and large, tilts heavily in that direction. That Luke was the word I use is enculturated, that he was educated and spent most of his time sort of steeped in the culture of probably Hellenistic Second Temple Judaism, right? Probably within the Hellenistic diaspora.
Great. And now I think I would like also to involve the other, you and the other also members of a panel about the central question. What do you mean? What do we mean about within Judaism? you know, there is a lot of debate today about what it means. For instance, some scholars, some colleagues says, first we should define what Judaism is, and then to see if Luke or Paul or any other documents of early Christianity fit in these boundaries. Other people say, why should we do so? Because Judaism at the time of Jesus was so diverse. It's impossible actually to define what Judaism was in the first century. So within Judaism means more within the diversity of Second Temple Judaism. And of course, all New Testament texts are Jewish simply because they were written in a time in which Christianity did not exist as a separate religion from Judaism, but was a Jewish movement. So by definition, all New Testament texts are Jewish, at least until the mid-2nd century. It does not make sense to think otherwise. I don't know what we think about this debate, and probably there is some reason in both approaches. But I would like to listen from you and also from the other distinguished panelists, because I think this is the central issue. Josh, if you want to be first.
Yes. Well, I think, you know, I agree with what you just said, Gabriele, that before, say, Justin Martyr, we don't really have any examples of, you know, Gentile Christian writings that we could compare Luke and Acts to. And Justin Martyr is really the first self-consciously Gentile Christian, self-consciously non-Jewish writer who is trying to articulate a religious vision that is distinct from Jewish Christianity, as I would say is portrayed in Luke and Acts. I don't know if maybe Isaac has some thoughts, or Jocelyn, but to me it seems, as you mentioned, Gabriele, kind of obvious that, you know, if Christianity had not yet emerged as a distinct, you know, sort of a monolithic religion, then of course we have to read these early texts from within Judaism, from within, as a Jewish part of a Jewish movement.
You like to add? Now I'm trying to involve our panelists. I'm
happy to start to chime in. I want to thank everybody who is behind the creation of this Meet the Author series. I think it's a wonderful initiative. So thanks for inviting me to this, and looking forward to future discussions. I'm very grateful to have these kinds of conversations as well with you. It's something refreshing, not topics that one can usually talk about, say, when you're waiting for the bus. Hey, what do you think of within Judaism? Or was Luke a Jew or a Gentile? So it's really nice to have these conversations with everyone. Apropos the question, Gabriele, and I hope people don't mind if we go by first names here. The within Judaism question, I can respond to that later. I hope there'll be time to touch on some other points with regard to Joshua Smith's fine book. I use the term within Judaism sparingly, although and that may come as a surprise to some, I don't know. I sympathize with the followers and the people who have promoted that phrase. I think it emerged a bit before or while I was a doctoral student doing my own research on Matthew and Luke, because although we have this title from James Charlesworth's book, I believe, Jesus Within Judaism, somewhere within there, it's really the Paul Within Judaism school that launched that terminology, and that was kind of happening in the first decade of the 2000s when I was doing my work. So hence I didn't really adopt it because it wasn't something that was yet really out there. Instead, I spoke of reading Matthew or Luke as Jewish texts and so forth. I'm also influenced by Daniel Boyarin. And if one reads Daniel Boyarin's book, Judaism in the Keyword Studies, published by Rutgers University Press, you will know that that Daniel Boyarin in general doesn't like the term Judaism, period. So it's not just what do we mean by the word within, but also just Judaism prefers the term Jewishness. And I do sympathize with them. I'm not somebody who's calling for the dismantlement of this term Judaism, but there's always that inevitable slippery slope that will, slide into reifying Judaism as just a religion in the image of Christianity, as Christianity is usually understood. And so in my personal use, when I use the term within Judaism, if we're speaking about a text like Luke and Acts or about the author, I think of Judaism as Jewishness in Boyarin's sense of the term. And it means to all things Jewish that Jews do. It can be, of course, religious cultic observances like the Sabbath, kosher laws, kashrut, purity laws, festivals, worship of one deity, etc., you name it. But it's also all those other Jewish doings that don't fall necessarily under the category of religion that belong to Jewishness. And I would make a case, and I stand by it, at least for the time being, that the Paul within Luke Acts, at least, is within Jewishness. Everything he does is Jewish as a Jew. He identifies fully, not just with the Jewish customs, but also with the Jewish people, the Jewish nation, to the very end. And so in that sense, I would say Luke and Acts are within Judaism.
Yeah, and Isaac, I would add to that. I think a piece that I tried to articulate with my book was that, you had mentioned in your book, in your dissertation, that you were reading Matthew and Luke as Jewish texts. And I think the question that really sort of sparked my interest here was, are Jewish texts written by Jewish authors, right? Can we speak of a text as having a sort of cultural or religious or even ethnic valence without necessarily saying something about the perspective of the author of those texts?
I think that's where it's complicated for me. In general, I agree with you, but just thinking logically, we set up criteria to say this is Jewishness, and a text may or may not embody that. What it does for me is it raises a question between ethnicity and textual transmission, or ethnicity and product, that I don't think is always clear in these conversations. If we had a set of criteria, I think we would probably too narrowly define it. Was the author of Luke also probably a Roman citizen? Maybe, probably. And if so, should we be talking about Jewish Roman texts in some way? Like, how do you define or separate out those different overlaps that I think are inherent in ethnic distinctions among people groups.
Following this line, Josh, Scott. Again, I have a question. What makes a text Jewish? Okay, is the ethnicity of the author, or as Isaac, I don't know if you are pointing more on the Jewishness of the content more than the Jewishness of the author, because I wonder, for instance, what difference will make if Luke was an Hellenistic Jew or a proselyte or a God-fearer. I don't see that will make a lot of difference for define his work as Jewish. I don't know. I mean, for instance, how important, how relevant is ethnicity for the definition of the Jewishness of a text? And I mean the ethnicity of the author or the ethnicity of the content. I mean, the identification with being part of a Jewish people or being part of the ethnic identity. So these are questions that I have. And another question that I have very much is, can we talk in the first century of some New Testament texts that are less or more Jewish? Because I don't know. I mean, from my perspective, I cannot make any distinction, because all New Testament texts written before the parting of the ways are Jewish. So I cannot say, I don't know, that James is more Jewish than Paul, or Luke, or Matthew is more Jewish than Matthew. Or Matthew is more Jewish than Luke. So I don't like this kind of language, but I understand that it depends a lot from what we consider as the determinant, the relevant factor for defining the Jewishness of the text.
Jocelyn, what do you think about these matters?
I'm asking myself, is Judaism, is all Jewish belief and practice the same across the ancient world of people who self-identify as Jewish? So that's sort of one question, both of maybe individual beliefs and practices, but also just the culture that they're in, and to what extent are they isolated from other influences? You know, who knows? I haven't researched that thing. I have made arguments that both the author of Luke Acts and the author's audience are Jewish, that are the intended audience anyway, are Jewish. I think it's easy to read Luke Acts as a work by a Gentile for Gentiles in the community over the last almost 2,000 years that is essentially Gentile Christians. It's very easy to read it as, and I just like to go against the tide. I think it's very, very easy also to read it as a book written by a Jewish author for a Jewish audience. And the term within Judaism, I don't spend a lot of time trying to work that out.
No, my question is, does it make really a big difference whether Luke was a Gentile or a Jew in terms of defining the Jewishness of his work?
I wonder about that. It's not a question I've asked myself before. I think that to read Luke as the work of a Gentile for Gentiles is one reading, and that to read Luke as a work of a Jew for Jews is another reading. Both have been defended and articulated, both views. But I think it makes a difference how, I think going back to what Joshua said at the beginning about especially the end of Acts. You know, I'm going to the Gentiles now. Okay, is that Paul just wiping the dust off his feet and going to a different town now? Or is it what he's been doing the whole entire time, always Jews first, then Gentiles. First the Jew, then the Greek.
I mean, the short answer, Gabriele, to your question, does it matter whether we conceive of the author as a Gentile or a Jew? The short answer is yes. And Joshua Smith's book has finally demonstrated that. Now, there are multiple questions that have been raised here. They're really excellent questions. I think I'd like to go back to actually the central question, which Joshua Smith so sharply formulates and raises in his book, and what his book is all about, which is, if we think of a text like Luke and Acts as being Jewish texts, are they not the productions of a Jewish author? You know, that is the question. And I just want to commend Joshua for embarking on that enterprise, because it's a monograph that I've never seen before, or nothing's coming to mind in my recent memory, at least, of such a thorough, sophisticated, sustained analysis of not just the authorship of a work, mind you, that is anonymous, but also the notion of authorship itself, and the relationship of authorship to texts. I think that Joshua Smith's book brings a level of sophistication, you know, theoretical sophistication to this discussion that really moves the discussion forward, not just for when we're talking about the identity of Luke, but really any author of a text where we don't know at least who exactly is the author. We're not dealing with Justin Martyr, we're not dealing with Paul. Those people, we know who they are. But what about these anonymous texts? And so Joshua brings literary theory into the conversation, cognitive linguistics, social linguistics, etc., that can't be rehearsed here. So I commend Josh for doing that, and really encourage everyone to engage in that. You know, usually when you look at the question of the identity of Luke, just peruse some of the standard commentaries, and you get, after probably the referencing to the earliest tradition, namely Saint Irenaeus of Lyon, that Luke, the beloved physician and inseparable companion of Paul, wrote the 2 volumes we call Luke and Acts. There's then a list of pros and cons, or arguments in favor of Luke's Jewish or Gentile background, or against Luke's Jewish or Gentile background. And usually the list is, you know, bullet points are knowledge of the Septuagint, Greek competence, interest in the Gentiles, supposed ignorance about Jewish practice, etc. And then the commentator, the New Testament exegete, reaches some kind of verdict, usually tilted in favor of the Gentile, as Luke being a God-fearer, perhaps, maybe a proselyte, perhaps even a pagan, before becoming a follower of Jesus. What Joshua does first is, mind you, unsettle and really weaken the foundation of the tradition, the supposed tradition that supports this notion that Luke was a Gentile. I was surprised, and I learned a lot with the reception history of the author of Luke, that actually if you look at the early Christian late antique receptions of Luke, and even beyond in the pre-modern period, there might be more authors, Christian authors, who thought that Luke was a Hebrew or a Jew than a Gentile. So that already unsettles the foundation, first of all. And, you know, I don't want to talk too much, but I did some further hunting that was inspired by Joshua's work. And I came across further further receptions that aren't in Joshua's monograph about this reception. In one work that is dated from the 5th century CE, and I'm just looking through my notes here to find it. It's from Quaestiones et Responsiones ad Orthodoxos. It's a work that's misattributed to Justin Martyr, but it belongs to a genre in late antiquity known as questions and answers, where you have a series of questions and then answers to these theological questions in a form of dialogue. And in question 133 of this work, the author deals with the genealogies of both Matthew and Luke and defends their reliability by asserting that both Matthew and Luke were Hebrews of Hebrews, Hebraioi ex Hebraion, who meticulously reproduced the genealogical records of Israel's kings and priests. So this phrase Hebraio ex Hebraion, first of all, it's very striking to see a Christian author seeing Luke in this way along with Matthew, probably derives from Paul's own self-identification in Philippians 3, verse 5, where he talks about himself as being a Hebraios ex Hebraion. So on two major fronts, Joshua really makes a real contribution here to the authorship, the question of authorship. It's the literary theoretical sophistication, but also the reception history, which I think opens new horizons to look now, I would say, at things like, I would love to see a monograph in the future about the reception history of Theophilus. What did Christians think about Theophilus? Because as Joshua notes in his book, whoever wrote Luke and Acts expects a lot from the part of his audience, probably he who wrote this work. So it'd be intriguing to dig further and see who is the audience in the Christian imaginaire in late antiquity. But I'll stop there. That's the long answer. For me, the short answer is to come back to Gabriele. Yes, ethnicity in this case matters, because there's a lot of a prioris that have become entangled in the discussion of Luke Acts and how one interprets Luke Acts.
Thanks. I see that Benjamin Wright has joined us, and I think it's an interesting question that goes directly to the point of the title of the book. If you want to.
Sure. Hi, it's great to see all my Enoch seminar friends. Josh Smith, thank you for an excellent book. And Josh Scott, thanks for the surprise invitation to join by video from Panera Bread. So I've got a number of questions, but I'll just throw out this one that I've put in the chat already. And that is, somebody raised, I think it was Isaac, raised the question of the portrayal of Paul in Acts, which of course I'm quite interested in, and wondering whether or not it's fair to describe Paul both as a devout Jew as well as perhaps a Christian in Acts. And if that's the case, then perhaps the author thinks of himself similarly, in as much as the author includes himself very closely in the Pauline orbit, certainly in Acts. And why do we have to choose between whether or not he was a Jew or a Christian, particularly before the ways it parted? Isn't the question whether or not he was ethnically a Jew or a Gentile? So I'm interested to hear Josh Smith and then maybe others parse out the question about, why do we have to choose? And in particular for Josh Smith, why he posed his book with that kind of title, Paul was not a Christian. Don't you really mean Paul was not a Gentile Christian?
Yeah,
Thank you.
yeah, that's a great question. So, I mean, just purely surface level, right? The title of the book is sort of a cheeky homage to Pam Eisenbaum's book, Paul Was Not a Christian, right? And Pam was one of my dissertation readers, and so this was just kind of a tip of the hat to Pam. But on another level, I think what I was trying to do with the title was also invite exactly this kind of discussion, right? That, okay, well, what do we mean when we're talking about Christians and what do we mean when we're talking about Christians and Jews in the first century? And even, I would say, because this kind of goes back to my discussion of Pierre Nora and landscapes of memory and his theory of how history is always more relevant to what we're doing in the present than exactly what happened in the past. To also reflect on those sets of identities today as they've sort of emerged into discrete, for lack of a better term, sort of monolithic religious identities. So, you know, part of that was, well, it was kind of a joke, but on the other hand, I think that it also invites a deeper discussion of, well, what is it that we mean when we say Jewish or Christian? You know, I think it might be Timothy Gabrielson, maybe, who speaks of the sort of unacknowledged binaries that are at work in a lot of, especially New Testament scholarship, scholarship of early Christianity. So what I wanted to do was sort of push those binaries to the forefront, right, and actually force us to take an account of them. Does that sort of answer your question?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, it does make sense if we're talking about the historical Paul to pose that question, because the term Christian as a kind of outsider category doesn't even seem relevant during Paul's lifetime. But depending on when you date Acts, right? Yeah. So that's another question I had for you. I mean, our earliest Roman evidence, whether it's Suetonius, Tacitus, Pliny the Younger, I mean, there's a clearly identifiable group, Christians, that doesn't seem to be confused with Jews. And that's certainly earlier than Justin Martyr. It's earlier than Marcion. You know, the time of Paul and the time of when Luke Acts was written seems to be, you know, quite different already within the period of, I don't know, 40, 50, 60 years. And so I think the questions may be different. And I just want to make sure we're not confusing different kinds of questions from the 50s, say, versus, I don't know, if Steve Mason's right and the author knows Josephus, and we're talking about an early second century writer, you know, perhaps operating in a different climate.
Yeah, this seems to me kind of the biggest area that I really need to spend more time focusing on is the dating of Luke and Acts. At the moment, I'm kind of agnostic about it, right? I don't deal as much with the dating of these texts as I should, but I will point out, you know, Christianos or Christianoi, it only appears 3 times in the entire New Testament, right? And one of those times is in First Peter, and the other 2 are in Acts. And what I find really interesting is not just the appearance of the word in a text, but the valence that word is given by the author, right? And I think it is often assumed, you know, what is it, Acts 11, where Luke says, oh, it was at Antioch that they were first called Christians. So we just sort of assume that this had become a widespread, distinct identity. But both times in Acts 11 and in Acts 26, the term Christian is a designation that is given by outsiders. And Luke doesn't really give much of an indication that he adopts that designation for himself as a positive thing, right? It's there are examples of other early Christian writers. I'm thinking of like Ignatius, right, who is and obviously Justin Martyr, who are very self-consciously identifying themselves as a thing called a Christian. But I don't know. I think there could be a case to be made that just the acknowledgement of Luke's acknowledgement in Acts 11 that they were first called Christians says something about the cultural knowledge, the cultural awareness of this group called Christians at the time Luke was writing, right? But as far as a term that Luke would adopt for himself, or that Luke has positive associations with, or his readers would have had positive associations with, I'm not sure that we can make that connection yet with Luke.
Josh, in any case, I think that the idea that Luke was not a Christian, or that Paul was not a Christian, of course, is a provocative title, okay? And the goal, if I understand correctly, to see we should not read Paul or Luke as belonging to a religion that is different from Judaism, because essentially this is the point. Obviously, neither you or Pamela want to say that Paul or Luke were not believers in Jesus, in Christ, or obviously. And on the other hand, we don't want even to say that Luke was a Jew, it means was a Jew as anybody else. Of course, Luke has a distinctive identity within the diversity of Second Temple Judaism as a follower of Jesus. So I think that we can find, because I see also other people in the chat are asking, emphasizing this point. I think that we can find a balance, I mean, in the sense that if we say that Paul Luke was not a Christian, it doesn't mean that he was not a believer in Jesus, or was not part of a movement that already had a distinctive identity within Judaism. The point that I guess, I mean, I think you want to make is, and also Pamela want to make, is that we don't have to think of Luke or Paul as having a self-understanding of being part of something else than Judaism. I mean, so I mean, to a certain extent, we can even say that Luke was Jews and Christian. If with the term Christian, we do not define Christianity as a separate religion, but as part of a Jesus movement. Of course, we prefer not to use the same term that, as you say, at the beginning did not have this kind of connotation. I mean, but I think that this is what you wanted to express. Am I correct?
Yeah, absolutely. And so I was actually just thinking about, E.P. Sanders has, one of the hallmarks of his common Judaism is an identification with the history and fate of the Jewish people, which is actually, I mean, maybe to go back to what Joshua Scott said earlier, a sort of indication about, provides at least maybe a little bit of grist for the mill in thinking about how an author of a text would locate themselves. I think Luke in his texts obviously identifies the movement about which he writes with the history and fate of the Jewish people, and he does so to a greater degree than he seeks to identify with the Roman Empire, right? Like I think that there are ways of locating an author by degrees, or maybe even by, kind of in a spectrum that say, okay, well, he kind of identifies himself less in this quadrant and more so in this quadrant. if that makes sense. And I also I want to acknowledge, a lot of what we're talking about, it's just part of the fuzziness that is inherent in the humanities, right? It's like being human. But absolutely, Gabriele, I agree that it's not an either or thing in this instance.
So other points that our panelists or members of the audience want to raise? Josh?
I had a question. I don't want to dominate the topics, but I found it really helpful as you went through the reception history of Luke. That, of course, that you provided the text, but provided commentary and helping the reader think through the relationship between the respective author and Luke. One thing that was interesting to me, though, is unless I missed it, I don't think you addressed the relationship of genre in the reception history, how Luke is portrayed in certain types of literature by certain authors. And so forgive me if I've missed it, but you talk about Ephraim the Syrian as an Eastern writer, geographical, but that's also a category, I think, of genre and how you use it in the description, and I could be wrong. But then Palatine Apostles List, you talk about Jerome and commentaries and letters in particular. Could you say more, if there's time, if you want to go in this direction, about the relationship of Luke and the reception history in specific genre of the authors writing about Luke?
Oh man, what a fascinating question. Yeah, so in total honesty here, this is not something I've thought of before. I think so. It was right as I was finishing up the book. I think it was Sean Adams' book on genre. Oh gosh, what's the title? Is it Greek text, Jewish authors, or something to that effect? It's an excellent book, but it came out just right as I was wrapping things up. I think that might be helpful, but honestly, I will have to spend some time thinking about this and thinking about how Luke and Acts have been used, and I use that term intentionally, by later Christian authors, and the role that genre plays. That's just a really fascinating question. Part of me wants to say that there's an apologetic motive underlying most of these texts, regardless of the genre that they locate the text within. But beyond that, I'm not so sure. This is really interesting.
Can I ask a question?
Yes.
Changing the topic just a little bit. I was really fascinated, Joshua, by your use, your attention to Luke's language, and especially how thoroughly and just Luke's versatility with biblical interpretation. It's kind of a hobby horse of mine. So, and so I'd like to ask you about when you're discussing Luke's use of Luke's allusions to various texts of scriptures, and then you bring in Richard Hays, and especially Hays's conclusions that Luke and all other writers is sort of Richard Hays's idea that Luke uses these allusions to draw readers' attention or the audience's attention to parallels or echoes, and so that you would, as a reader, then think about the scripture that was being echoed, and then compare, contrast, understand what Luke is saying within the general context of the scripture that Luke is echoing. Am I sort of going along the right lines here for you? What I want to know is, how is that, or is that a Jewish way of interpreting the scriptures?
Oh, that's really interesting. I don't know that I ever say that Luke's elusiveness itself is a Jewish way of reading scripture, but it is a fundamental, like a key characteristic of Luke's interpretation of Israel's scriptures. I think so. The point that I was trying to get at, and also with, with elusiveness, with all the caveats in place, right? With elusiveness, you're always going to have, you're going to be open to charges of what is it? Hearing hoofbeats and thinking zebras, right? Like just, but elusiveness is sort of in the eye of the beholder at some point. But I think the point that I was trying to get at with Luke's elusive interpretation of Israel's scriptures is that Luke alludes to texts in a way that only people who are already deeply familiar with Israel's scriptures are going to catch, right? They would have to be pretty well read in at least the Septuagint to hear what Luke is saying, or to read what Luke is writing and say, ah, yeah, I know what that's a reference to. And as an extension of that, one of the things that I found really difficult to work with was we just have almost no examples of non-Jewish, sort of formerly pagan, Gentile Christian writers who have that same level of versatility and that thorough awareness, that thorough knowledge, the shared cultural knowledge of Israel's scriptures. I think you can say that we have that in Justin Martyr, but Justin Martyr's work is also doing something entirely different with his references to Israel's scripture than what Luke is doing. And this is, I think I've been really influenced by Susan Wendell's book here on scriptural interpretation and community self-definition, that both Justin Martyr and the author of Luke Acts are interpreters of Israel's scriptural tradition. Justin self-consciously alludes to Israel's scriptures to basically say, you know what, these were never Jewish scriptures to begin with. These are now our scriptures, right? Because we Christians have the actual knowledge of God, right? Luke is, again, to kind of go back to Sanders, referencing Sanders earlier, Luke is self-consciously identifying the early Christian movement within Israel, and as what is it? Jakob Yervel. So is it like coextensive with historical and ethnic Israel? So I think that's a really interesting question, but I do want to kind of specify that it's not necessarily elusiveness itself that makes Luke's interpretation Jewish, but it's the elusiveness in a way that reveals his extensive knowledge with the base material of the tradition, which I have not seen any evidence that we have examples of Gentiles or God-fearers who have that same extensive knowledge, or even would have had the capability to have acquired that extensive knowledge of Israel's scriptures.
Josh, I found your reference to Justin very important. I mean, very enlightening, because certainly the perspective of Justin is very different from the perspective of Luke. No? The way in which he looks at the Jewish tradition. I mean, Luke, the author of Luke and Acts, looks at this tradition from within, not from the outside. Okay, and I think this is actually, I don't see any Christian writer in the first century that has a different perspective. They all look from inside, from the inside. I mean, the same that we have said about Luke could be said about Matthew or Paul or James, or they are all. So in this sense, I think that your point, in any case, Luke accept this perspective from within Judaism. Okay, so now the question is, can we say something more about what kind of Jew Luke was? At the end, this is a question. Do you think that, do we think, I mean, because it's not only for you the question, do you think that the idea that essentially we are dealing with a Hellenistic Jew, somebody living in the diaspora, this could explain also the way in which he referred to the Judaioi in the Acts of Apostles, from a perspective of a diaspora. Certainly was a follower of Jesus. What can we say about his relation with Paul, or more in general with the tradition of Paul? So once we have, once we have accepted, we have made the main step of accepting the Jewishness of Luke, then there is a lot of questions, a lot of fascinating questions about what kind of Jew Luke was, what was his origin. I mean, because before being a follower of Jesus, what kind of Jew he was, and also about his position within the early Jesus movement.
Yeah, this is excellent. And I love the shift from, the question isn't really whether or not Luke was Jewish. The question is now, what kind of Jew was Luke? And
also what kind of Christian he was.
Yeah, yes, exactly. Yeah.
That's the true question.
And I think one of the things that has that I have loved the most about studying Acts in the past couple of years has been noticing that the Paul of Acts is more Jewish than the Paul of his letters, right? That you could say the Luke and Paul actually holds in many cases a higher view of the law and Torah observance than sometimes the Paul of the Pauline epistles kind of lets on. I think that is a huge question worth pursuing. I also think that you can sort of place Luke sort of over and against even the Jewishness of, say, someone like Mark, right? Who, especially when we're talking about synoptic studies, right? There are things that Luke, as an editor, actually changes to emphasize more than the other gospel writers. The observance to the Mosaic law is one of those things that Jakob Yarvel pointed this out many years ago, but Jesus in Luke never actually collapses all of Jewish law into the love God and love your neighbor as yourself kind of the legal summary, in the same way that he does in Mark and Matthew. Rather, I think it's just in Matthew, but I think so. Luke's attentiveness to the halakhic concerns of Torah, right? I think that is a piece that illuminates part of your question. I think the other thing that I see as informing, particularly my view that Luke was probably from a diaspora community, is I still go back to this piece about he has a funky view of Palestinian geography, right? He has some interesting his mental map of Judea is a little bit distorted. Although, as you know, Isaac has mentioned, he does sort of hit the nail on the head when it comes to like the distance between the Mount of Olives and Jerusalem being a Sabbath's day journey away, right? But Luke also seems very concerned with this might be an anachronism here, but the sort of the nationalities surrounding the Judea in the ancient Mediterranean, that he seems really concerned with what's going on outside of Jerusalem, almost as much as he's concerned with what's going on within Jerusalem. So I think that has sort of informed my perspective on Luke being situated within a diaspora community. But I am totally open to changing my mind on that.
There's a question in the chat about illusions. Can we go back to that for a minute? I'm just full of ideas that I want to put out there and see what you or anybody else thinks. So I think that a lot of the illusions in Luke are illusions that highlight, that portray Jesus and his apostles and as prophets. So they are prophets like Elijah and Elisha because Jesus transfers his spirit to his followers, and that gives his followers the credentials to do what they do in the book of Acts, because they now have the spirit of Jesus. Luke changes Jesus's last words to make it effective. Father, into your hands I commend my spirit. And then at the beginning of Acts, that spirit is poured out on his disciples. So it's like this transfer of power. And then they do the miracles of Elijah. They heal, they raise a kid from the dead. They heal lame people, blah, blah, blah. So that's one aspect of it. They're a prophet like Moses because they are rejected, just as Moses was rejected. Stephen's speech really highlights that. They are a prophet like Jeremiah because Jeremiah predicted the destruction of the temple, and it happened. And he gave reasons for that, and Jesus does the same thing. So I think a lot along those lines as far as the illusions go, that it's not so much maybe as, anyway, I think Luke is always trying to make a point. I think there are certain concerns in the Christian community about the validity of all this stuff, especially however many years after the crucifixion, and he hasn't come back yet, and we're all getting arrested, and what is this thing about Gentiles, and we're not really sure about it. And so I think Luke is just systematically addressing those concerns, and one of the ways he bolsters his argument is, well, Jesus was a prophet. They're all like prophets. Do you trust the prophets? Well, they're inspired by God.
Yeah, that actually even goes back to his treatment of the rich man and Lazarus parable, right? In Luke, that if they're not going to believe the scriptures in the prophets, they're not going to even believe someone who rises from the dead.
And he says specifically, right, Moses and the prophets.
Yeah.
And I meant to make a record of this before I came online, but there are specific instructions in the law of Moses and specific instructions in, I think it's in Deuteronomy, and then specific instructions in Isaiah about kindness to the poor, not being the term I'm thinking of is pejorative, and I don't want to say it. Not being a skinflint, but being generous with what you have to people who don't have very much. And it is literally in Moses and the prophets. And Luke, I think, just for people who are familiar with those scriptures, he just goes bing, bing when he just says that Moses and the prophets. And you all know where that is, don't you?
Josh, I think we can see really in this last years a growing consensus on reading the text of the New Testament as Jewish texts. I think the consensus has grown a lot. I mean, now we are having conferences, media. I mean, what at the beginning was only the point of some scholars has become now more accepted, more universally accepted. I mean, in terms of considering the text in the New Testament as part of Second Temple Jewish literature, as part of a diversity of this literature. Another point that you make, and I think should be emphasized, is that contrary to what people usually think, there is no trace of supersessionism in Luke, as it is not in Paul. I mean, and here, Isaac, I agree with you. I mean, reception history is very important because when I don't know. I mean, I was reviewing recently the origin of the doctrine of supersessionism that usually is traced back to Paul, but nobody in antiquity was taking Paul as the founder of the doctrine of supersessionism. So sometimes we take for granted the things that do not have a reality in when we study ancient sources. Okay, and the same is true for Luke. I mean, because if we think how many times the Acts of Apostles have been read as a sort of parable of emancipation of Judaism, of Christianity from Judaism. I mean, from Jerusalem to Rome. And then when we read what is written in the text, and also the way in which the text was read in antiquity, we see that really there is no foundation for this kind of ideas.
Yeah, this is one of the things that I've there are concepts that kind of worked their way into my head and just wouldn't let go, right? And one of those concepts is the way in which one generation's interpretive innovations become the next generation's interpretive assumptions. And I think you can see this, for example, you know, these early patristic sources are engaged in polemical debates, right, with early Jewish interpreters, and there's a lot of back and forth in terms of who owns what text and how texts are going to be interpreted. A lot of negotiation going on. By the time you get to say like early medieval Christian readers of Scripture, those polemical debates are even further polemicized. So I think of in the book I use an example of the Venerable Bede, right, who's writing in was it Northumbria in the, I think, 8th century, and is a cloistered monk who has never met a Jewish person in his life, and yet writes the most vile, horrific things about Jews and Judaism. But he does so because his only sources, his only reading is the patristic writers, right? And so he ends up adopting their interpretive assumptions and then even pushing those assumptions even further. And then you even see this by the time you get to, say, Martin Luther. Martin Luther is reading medieval writers like Bede, who and Martin Luther adopts Bede's prejudices and pushes those prejudices even further. So I think your point is exactly right, Gabriele, that you know, it is possible to make a supersessionist out of Paul in a even though Paul's own writings aren't supersessionist, right? It's that it's the way these textual interpretations develop. And it also, I believe, is part of the importance for understanding how history is done, like sort of on a methodological and on a methodological level, like what is the purpose? What work is being done here to push a sort of an ideological agenda in many cases.
I wouldn't want to leave to be the party pooper Luke or other New Testament texts too easily off of the hook from supersessionism. All depends what we mean by this term supersessionism, which is a category there to be discussed about its utility and so forth. Commercial break, by the way, we do have this this fall at SBL for the Society for Post-Supersessionist Theology, on which I serve a panel. I see Ralph Corner is among the participants here. We're going to be discussing reading Revelation after supersessionism. Depending on what we mean by this term, I would argue that Luke is soteriologically a supersessionist, insofar as it seems to me that he expects all Jews and Gentiles, for that matter, to believe in Jesus. There is no name under the heavens by which one may be saved. That's in a speech by Peter in Acts 4. There is the warning also delivered in Acts 3 to a Jewish audience. You better watch out. Don't reject this prophet like you rejected Moses. Otherwise, you will be cut off. You will face destruction. So although ecclesiologically, Luke does not, in my reading here, redefine Israel as the church or something along those lines. Israel remains Israel, but there are certain people among Israel that are in trouble. We might say, to use David Novak's terminology, Luke is a soft supersessionist. Ultimately, he wants, as I suppose some or many Christians want today, for others, Jews included, to believe like me, to be like me. That doesn't mean, of course, that one has to embrace that theology, or that there isn't a space actually to read Luke Acts theologically in a truly post-supersessionist way. Now, one thing I'd like to do is, if I may, I want to come back to the big hippopotamus in the room that Benjamin White brought up, and I'm glad he brought conversations about Luke and Paul to Panera. Let's keep that trend going on here. With the title of this panel here, and the title of the book, which for me is really the big hippopotamus, if I may put it that way. Luke was not a Christian, or was Luke a Christian? Was Luke a Jew or a Christian? In some ways, I would argue all of the New Testament authors were Christians, and Paul included, even if he doesn't use the term Christianos, his letters are permeated with Christ talk, right? Jesus is Christos. Those who believe in Jesus are in Christos, with Christos, are part of the body of Christos, will rise with Christos, will meet Christos in the air and be with him for always. And why not even entertain the possibility? I know this is entering the realm of speculation, that the term Christianoi, Christians, was already known to Paul in Paul's time. It's simply he doesn't mention it. I mean, that's not a surprise to me. We only have 7 of his emails that have survived antiquity, right? That's the term I use pedagogically when I speak about Paul's letters to my students. He wrote some emails to specific addressees. We shouldn't expect him to have included all of his knowledge, all of his worldview in these sporadic letters, if I may put it that way. I can well imagine in a public forum like the City of Acts, some people who are outsiders to the Jesus movement, seeing this new trend here of people who are obsessed with Jesus and talking about him as Christos, just quipping around the fountain, the water fountain. Oh, there come those Christianoi, and by that they simply meant Messianists, Messiah fans. I don't know, Christniks or Chabadniks, if we're going to search for some kind of contemporary analogy. And it wasn't a term that was useful or meaningful yet at that time, when Paul was already himself an apostle preaching the good news to the Gentiles. I guess what I'm trying to get to here is, since this discussion is being recorded and is going to then later be posted on the wild, wild west of the World Wide Web, we have to be mindful of the public perception of our conversation to those few miserable souls that might listen to our discussion. To share an anecdote, years ago, I did have as required reading for an undergraduate course on the New Testament Pamela Eisenbaum's book, Paul Was Not a Christian. And most of the students were of Christian background in that course. They had a negative reaction to the title of the book, if I can put it that way. It just, for them, and I'm not suggesting, of course, that Pamela Eisenbaum or anyone here, I think we have this most sincere, I trust we have the most sincere quest to reclaim the Jewishness of Christianity, but an audience that's not initiated into the niceties of our specialized discussion might think, oh, we're against Christianity. We're saying Paul was not a Christian. And here they go. Now they're going to take even Luke. Now they're taking Luke, the Gentile Christian, away from us and saying that he was a Jew. And that's not the point of the discussion. I mean, in fact, it all just depends what we mean by Christian and what we mean by Jew. Joshua actually finally phrases this. I'm just trying to look for it in the pages. I think it's on page 117 to 118. After observing the difficulty in distinguishing Christian identity from Jewish identity, Joshua remarked as follows, quote, "We ought to resist the temptation to essentialize the complexities of first century social identity into discrete categories that rely on overemphasizing the differences between modern notions of Jewish and Christian. It seems to me that the more critical question, rather, is how to distinguish between a text written by a Jew, Christian or otherwise, and one written by a formerly pagan Gentile. This question invites further comparison between Luke Acts and other ancient Greco-Roman literature in antiquity. If Luke were writing as a Gentile, it would be crucial to find similarities to Luke's vast knowledge and nuanced interpretation of Israel's scriptures in the writings of other pagans and former pagans who also engage in some form of biblical interpretation." And end the quote. So the real, more germane question to us here is, was Luke a Gentile? Because depending on what we mean, then of course Luke was a Christian, and of course we don't have to set that in opposition to him being Jewish. He can absolutely be both. The problem, of course, is that today many Jews and Christians, if not most, right, think that Jew means not Christian and Christian means not Jew.
Yeah, thank you, Isaac, because I think that you summarized very well what we all said, maybe not so clearly before, because I also believe that we should not make this alternative, no, either Christian or Jew, because it doesn't make sense in the first century. Obviously, as I said, as I also said before, the point of the title is simply to be provocative and to say that neither Luke nor Paul are Christians as we mean today, okay? Because Christianity did not exist as a separate religion. But of course, saying that Luke and Paul are within Judaism, it doesn't mean that they don't belong to Christianity. And somebody else invented Christianity, I don't know when. Of course, Jesus, Paul, Luke belong to the history of Christianity. They are part of Christianity. Of course, we also have repeated the important point that Christianity at the time was a Jewish movement, was not a separate religion from Judaism. And in this sense, we have to understand that the situation in the first century was much different from the situation that we have today. But I welcome your concerns. I mean, that people that are listening to us are understanding properly what we mean, because sometimes, for instance, when I read that Paul or Luke were just ordinary Jews, what does it mean? There was nothing like being an ordinary Jew in the first century. I mean, they were followers of Jesus, so they have a distinct identity. So, and now that we are also living in a ecumenical age, is very important to emphasize that is important, that is possible now to claim that Luke and Paul and Jesus were at the same time Jew and part of the beginning of the Christian movement. So in this sense, I think was very, very important. We are almost at the end of our very lively conversation. I think we made some very good points. I mean, in terms of emphasizing the Jewishness of Luke Act. Of course, there are many other questions that, for me, for instance, would be very interesting. The question, what's next? Okay, what's next? I mean, for instance, for me, it would be very interesting. Very often we have taken the Jewishness of Paul or the Jewishness of Luke as a sort of the conclusion of our discourse. Okay, and my point is, what if we take the Jewishness of Luke or Paul as the beginning of our conversation? Because we should, I think we should not write books to prove that Paul or Luke were Jewish, because this seems even too obvious. We should write books to explain what it means, because it is a very, very interesting and fruitful starting point for our future research. We have a few minutes, and I would like to give our author, you did splendidly today, the opportunity to say some final thoughts about this conversation today. Even your comments, what was the reaction to the conversation we had with us today, and also, again, what is next? What do you think should be next?
Well, first, let me say I am so unbelievably grateful, both to Gabriele and to the panelists, Isaac, Jocelyn, Joshua, and the Enoch Seminar for inviting me into this conversation. This is very exciting to me, if for no other reason than it invites me to reconsider some things that I've written, which I haven't looked at in a while. But so I think also I've reflecting on a few things that Isaac has mentioned. The first is that I think it's important to have discussions like these in a world where it is widely assumed that Christian and Gentile mean the same thing, that they're synonymous. The other, and this sort of moves into Gabriele, your question about sort of future directions for the conversation, and it ties in with Isaac's point about supersessionism in Luke and Acts. I think it is possible to read supersessionism in Luke and Acts, or Luke and Acts as supersessionist, to the extent that, say, the author of the Pesher Habakkuk is also supersessionist, right? That this community was highly critical of Jerusalem, and specifically the temple referred to Jerusalem as a city built on blood, right? City of blood, and had sort of reappropriated the temple imagery of the Jerusalem temple as the dwelling place of God, and reappropriated that for itself. The community itself becomes the dwelling place of God. I see Luke doing much the same, especially in Acts, which also leads me to believe that for years and years, there has been so much work done comparing Luke and Acts to other Greco-Roman texts. I think we really need to see more comparative studies on Luke and Acts and other Second Temple Jewish texts, especially the texts at Qumran, but also other broader Hellenistic Jewish literature, as Sean Adams has done a really great job of collating those sources. I think that is the direction that the conversation would really benefit from, if more of those studies were conducted.
Good. Thank you to you, Josh, and to the three panelists. I enjoyed very much this conversation. I think it was an excellent format to discuss these issues. I'm looking forward to other conversations of this kind. Scott, do you have some announcement about the next meetings, the next event of the Enoch Seminar? And when is the book on the Rome conference, when will it be published?
I don't know the exact date of publication. Maybe Isaac could speak to that, but I've just dropped in the chat our updated 2024 schedule. So we hope everyone will join us for future events. Isaac, do you have an understanding when the publication date of our volume might be?
So Gabriele was alluding to, for those who aren't aware, there was a conference in Rome a couple of summers ago entirely dedicated to the question of Luke and Acts within Judaism, and papers that were selected and are still being peer reviewed by the publisher. I contacted them again, nagging them about an update on Monday, and have not received yet an update. But I've been told a month ago that we should know soon about their final decision. And so I'm very hopeful that this volume, which will be one of a kind as a collective enterprise, edited by Jocelyn, Joshua Scott, and myself, tentatively titled Luke and Acts within Judaism, will be out maybe by the end of this year.
Okay, great. Good. There is a lot of things going on, and on the Within Judaism perspective, we are currently working with Paula Fredrickson and Anders Runeson for an online conference in January. exactly on reading the New Testament within Judaism. So stay tuned, because there is a lot of things going on in the Enoch Seminar. And we hope to have the opportunity at the beginning of January 2025 to have a 3-day online conference on the Within Judaism perspective. And we see a lot of books just out these days, covering more or less all the text of the New Testament from this new exciting perspective. So thank you again for all of you that have taken part of this event, for those who have followed the event on Zoom or on Facebook, and to the ones that will listen to our conversation on YouTube. Bye.
Thanks, sir.
Thank you.
you.
Thank you.